My guest today is J.C. Cervantes, New York Times bestselling author whose books for children, young adults, and adults have been published in more than 12 countries and have appeared on national lists including the American Booksellers Association New Voices, Barnes& Noble's Best Young Reader Books, as well as Amazon, Apple, and Audible's Best Books of the Month. Today, we talk about becoming an author without a fancy degree, listening to your intuition and your gut when you're writing books for different target audiences, working with iconic author Rick Riordan, who wrote the Percy Jackson series, and so much more. I hope you enjoy the show. Hi, Jen. Welcome to Creative Inspired Happy. I'm thrilled to have you on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, you are a New York Times bestseller. You have written books for all ages, from middle grade to teen to adult. So I think we're going to have a lot to talk about. But what I love to start with is the big question, which is when did you know you wanted to be a writer? And then how did you get here? How did you make that happen?
So actually, I didn't know until much later in life. I loved story. I was an early reader. I was just, obsessed with books and story as a child, but I never thought about being an author as a career or being a writer. And so it wasn't until many, many, many years into my adulthood, and my youngest daughter, I have three daughters, my youngest daughter came to me and she was on her way to school and she said, will you write a story about my little bear while I'm away? And I said, okay. And so even though my degrees are in English, I'd never taken a creative writing class. My training was in rhetoric and more technical kind of writing. And I sat down and Evelyn, it was like this spark. I started writing longhand on a legal pad and I just fell in love with the process. And even though I come from an oral storytelling tradition and, I'd been telling stories my whole life, I'd never actually written one down. So that's how it all happened. And, one thing led to the other. It was a very sequential process. And, you know, got very involved with SCBWI and tried to learn the ropes and figure out publishing because I knew absolutely nothing and landed an agent, and here I am.
That sounds actually kind of similar to me as well. I had a literature degree as a kid, I loved reading. I loved books. I did some writing just for fun, as a kid, but never thought that it would be a career. Went to college, had a literature degree just because it was interesting, but no one had ever told me that I could write for a living. And so I also stumbled upon it later in
Yeah,
life after I'd been a lawyer and started in YA. So also, began my research with SCBWI, and so I'm
right.
kind of curious actually, like what were the steps that you like took to figure out the industry and to learn to write? Because are you self-taught? Did you take classes?
So I've never had a creative writing class. I really believe we're all wired for story. I just think that human beings naturally understand story, whether we can explain the story arc or the character arc or not. I don't think that's the point. I mean, we're ingesting story all the time, whether it's video games or movies or books or, stories in our neighborhood or stories we tell ourselves. And so I did a lot of research because I just, I was living in New Mexico. I mean, there's no publishing here. And I would go to Barnes and Noble and I would park it in the aisle and I would read Publishers Marketplace and how to get an agent and how to write a query letter. And then I started buying craft books. It was the first time I'd ever read a craft book. And so I started really paying attention to, how do you develop character? How do you, what's a speech tag? What do the first 5 pages need to be? What does that mean, inciting incident? Those kinds of things. So very much self-taught, lots of reading. I did several writing retreats that were more about networking, and I just kind of stumbled through. I mean, I just found my way, honestly.
I think I really love that because I had a similar path of just loving something, wanting to be able to do this, and then trying and falling on my face over and over again. And I know that there are people who, they have creative writing degrees or they go and get an MFA, and that's wonderful. But I love these stories of people who figured it out on their own because it kind of shows, I mean, not kind of, it really shows you can do this without having lots of financial
Yes.
resources, that you can teach yourself, that it isn't some kind of elite skill that only certain people can have. You can do it just by going to Barnes and Noble and reading. But I think you mentioned all these things you learned from the craft books. It's a lot. How did you ingest it all and then, put it all together into a story? How many, or another question, maybe more like point blank, how many manuscripts did you write that were terrible before you feel like you figured it out?
Well, so, in writing that story for my daughter, going back to that before I even started with the craft books, because my intention was not to write a book, right? And so I was writing the story and it kept growing, Evelyn. It kept growing and it kept growing. And then I started naturally doing chapter breaks and I was naturally inserting the hook, right? And again, I really believe it's because we're wired for sure. We understand, we know what we want when we're reading or consuming, and so it's the same way as a writer. And you're absolutely right that you don't need to have a fancy degree. You don't need to live in New York City. You don't have to have all the connections in the world. And I'm not saying that those things don't matter at some point down the road. All you have to have is that desire in your heart and the intention to create a really beautiful story. And as I was going through the craft books, some were really helpful, others I tossed to the side. And I was really patient with myself. I was in no rush. It's so funny because I remember thinking, oh my God, I think I'm writing a book. If I finish this and write the end, I'm amazing. I've accomplished everything. I've hiked the highest mountain in the world. That felt like such a big accomplishment for me. And so that's what I mean about it being sequential. I never sat down and started writing with the intention of, oh, and I want to get published and I want to have the best agent and I want to do that. It just wasn't in my periphery at all. And so it really was more of, let me just luxuriate in this story more than anything.
I love it. Do you still feel that way about the books now that you have a very established career? Maybe you have deadlines. Do you still get to luxuriate in the story?
No. I love that you asked that. I'm always on deadline, which is a privilege and a blessing. And I always remind myself of that whenever I complain to one of the girls or my husband. And I'm just like, oh my God, I had three projects on my desk last week at different iterations. So one was the final pass pages for one project. Another one was I'm drafting. I'm at the very beginning stages of drafting something new. And then the other was the first developmental edit on another book.
Oh
And
my
I was
gosh.
just like, oh my God, my head's going to explode. I can't. And so I had to take some deep breaths. As you know, what it's like to get an edit letter, they're always challenging no matter what. And so I don't often get to luxuriate, but what I do allow myself are breaks where I go on hikes and I think about the story and I find a way to fall in love with it again. Because it can start to feel very consumery, it can start to feel very businesslike, and there is that intersection between consumerism and art. And I just always want to be in the art side of things, and I know that I can't, but man, that's where I want to be. What about you?
Yeah, I think that that's very true, right? I mean, like if you're going to have a career, you need to be thinking about the business
Yeah,
side, right? Like how to build your author platform, are you writing stories where there's actually a market because you can't sell more books in the future to publishers if you refuse to write something that people will buy because they are businesses as well, right?
right.
But I am very much with you in that the pureness of the art, like the enjoyment of that feeling of playing with words, like this
Yes.
magic that we can create, right? Just out of nothing because we strung some words together. That's incredible. And it's my favorite thing. And
Yeah.
so it is kind of, it's hard, it's wanting to have a career in publishing is a dream. And then when you get here, you realize that that dream comes with like actual business responsibilities and it's a little bit of a
Right.
shock and it's a little bit of
Yeah.
a disappointment, but it's also kind of like very exciting, right? Because
Yeah.
now you're like, oh, I can make money now. Like I can do this
Right.
thing. I get to
Yeah.
make things up and people will pay me. It's crazy.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So how do you keep all these stories straight?
Well, I didn't write any of them that I didn't love from the beginning. And so it's just like catching up with an old friend. You just have to find your entry point and familiarize yourself with what you were doing. I tend to kind of overcomplicate plots. I always tease my agent and say, someday I'm going to write the simplest plot on the planet. I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to do it. And so, yeah, I can't generally work on all at the same time. So it's not a simultaneous effort. I know I have to put a couple of the projects aside, and I don't always have three come in at once. I mean, that is not a, that is not a normal occurrence. But I just, focus on, okay, which one has the first deadline? All right, that's the one I'm going to sink into. And then I get that off my plate. I don't know. I mean, can you, if you're working on multiple projects, if you're juggling multiple projects, can you work on two of them at once, or do you have to do like one at a time and then pull out the next?
Yeah, so last year I had a year very similar to what you just described, where like within a span of a week, I might be working on three different things. And that was because I just happened to have books with different publishers and their timelines coincided. But also similar to what you're describing, they were at different stages of development. And so I feel like the most fragile part of a story is when I'm writing a zero draft or a first draft. I'm still learning the characters. I don't really completely know who they are or where the story's going, or even the voice isn't totally
Hmm.
developed yet. That's the kind that takes the most attention. Once you're a few drafts in and you're doing developmental edits or you're proofreading, it's a little easier for me to switch, but generally can't do it in the same day. How about you? Can you do it in the same day, or do you have any like tricks to kind of like separate in your mind?
I mean, it's all about what is required, right? So if the deadlines don't line up with my preferences, then I'll get up at dawn and I'll work on, let's say, the development edits of one project, or usually I'll actually draft in the morning, and then I can do edits in the afternoon. And so I can switch gears sometimes like that, but the developmental edits I'm working on right now are actually for the second book of Daggers of Ire, and it is just consuming so much of my brain power and bandwidth that I can't even, like, by the time it's 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I am toast. I have nothing left to give. They're just the editor has asked some really brilliant questions, as brilliant editors do, that have led me down different paths. And I don't know if this ever happens to you, but I'll sometimes say, oh God, that means I have to pull this thread and it's going to unravel that chapter. Or I could just not. But the story's going to be better if you do the thing. And so, of course, you end up doing it. But man, do I resist it sometimes.
I always put it off. So I'll see something really big that I know I have to do, but I'll make excuses in my head for how I can probably keep this way. The editor is probably wrong. And I'll just kind
Right.
of like leave that comment unresolved. But by the time I'm done with all the rest of the edits, I come back to it and I know, just like you're saying, you know in your gut when something would be better, and it's just kind of the lazy part of you and the part that
Yeah.
really wants to hold on to that precious bit that you wrote that you thought was so perfect already.
Right.
You can let it
Yeah.
go at that point. It just, you have to work yourself into it.
Yeah.
So
For sure.
we have like a lot of in the audience, we have writers who are brand new. We have writers who
Mhm.
have published a couple books, and then people, also like you and me who've published a lot. And I feel like there's things to learn for everyone. But for the ones who are at the beginning of the career, could you explain a little bit about like the difference between what it's like when you're drafting and then when you're doing developmental edits, or even what developmental edits mean?
Sure. So drafting is the play that you were talking about earlier when you said that you just get to play and luxuriate in the story. And the first round developmental edits are when you have sold the book and the editor has gone through and they're looking at the big world questions. And so usually I'll go through two developmental edits, and that's when you have an opportunity to really rethink maybe characters, or maybe even rethink the plot, or maybe you're going to add in a few more threads to enrich the plot, and it's generally questions. I mean, I've worked with so many editors now, and I've never had an editor say you need to change this. I mean, it's not directive at all. It's just more of these questions that get your imagination going. And then after the developmental edits, you will go through copy edits, which I think are challenging too. Everyone thinks, oh, I'm at copy edits, it's not going to be that hard. And I'm thinking, is it just me? And even so then you go through your copy edits, and then sometimes you go through a couple rounds of those, and then you go through your final pass pages, which is your last opportunity. Everything's been typeset. You get it as a PDF, and you have an opportunity to, if there's any last little thing, nothing big, that you want to change, you can. And so, yeah, it's quite intensive. And I think that now the respect I have for anyone who makes a film or a book, I realize all the hands and hearts that have touched that. Whereas before, I don't think I had an appreciation for how much. And when I first began in my career, I would compare my draft to a finished book. And I realized later, as I went through the editing process and I learned more about it, I realized that was so unfair to do to myself because there is no comparison. I mean, so many people have touched that book by the time, that it's out on the shelf. And so, yeah, so that's kind of in a nutshell what those edits are like.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, your point about so many hands and hearts have touched the book. It's so true because I think that a lot of lay people who aren't in the writing world, they think that when we talk about edits, it's just checking for grammar and punctuation,
Right.
and that it's so far from the truth because there's so much thought and love that goes into crafting to like molding the story into something that's your idea, and then helping it realize its complete full potential. And
Right.
it's like you're saying before too, like learning craft, there are ways that craft can break you. Like I went early on in my career, in my learning process, I was writing manuscripts. I started at this place like you where I felt like I had this natural storytelling ability, and then that manuscript was just pure joy and no technical skill at all, but that means that there were parts that it faltered, right? So then I went deep 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 into learning about craft, and so then my second manuscript was all the things I had learned, and I approached it like a very, very diligent student. And that manuscript was terrible for a totally different
Yeah.
reason because it became almost robotic, right? And then you
Yeah.
eventually figure out how to put it all together. And then we get to publishing and we have incredible editors and copy editors who help us really nurture these stories. And like,
Hmm.
what an amazing thing that we get to do and what
I
amazing
know.
people we get to work with.
I know. I feel so blessed, believe me.
So you have written for so many age groups, and I'm curious why. Like, what drew you to this? Why? What makes you decide I want to write for kids for this book, or I have an idea for teens, and you've also written books for adults.
So I never set out to write for any age category other than middle grade. That was, where my heart was. That's what I loved. I just love writing for kids. I love their imagination. I love their creativity. You're capturing them at this moment in time that's just so beautiful and innocent, and to get to be a part of that. And they're so willing to follow you, right? And so what happened for me, the reason that I ended up writing a young adult, a several young adult, and then adult, is because that's what the story demanded. And so all of my stories grow organically. They come to me as a first scene, always, 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 always. And if it's compelling enough, I want to know more about that scene and what's going on. And I have lots of questions, et cetera, et cetera. And so once I have that down, I kind of knew, oh, this is not middle grade. You just like it's an intuitive process. So I never set out to write. I never said, oh, I think I'll try adult now, or I think I'll try young adult, or ever. It's just what the story demands, and I've become a really good listener to the story, and I follow it. And I didn't used to do that. I would kind of resist that, that whole channeling notion, and now I trust it and I go with it, and where it lands is where it lands.
So when you're talking about listening, are you talking about like deciding which audience you're writing for, or are you talking about like just the story itself and the characters and where it goes?
The age category is intuitive always, and the rest of it, I think, would be the part that I'm listening to in terms of like really connecting to something that's almost like not even on our plane of existence, if that makes sense. And gosh, sometimes I'm just not connected, Evelyn. I mean, I just can't get there, and I'm going through the rote motions of, okay, all right, and then I end up trashing it all because it's not touching that deep part of myself as an artist that I want to get onto the page. And so that's when I have to go on the hike. That's when I have to go, talk. I have a friend who's really she does a lot of like intuitive counseling for artists, and kind of helps them like reconnect to that deep part of themselves, which is what is coming out on the page. And so it takes a long time to trust that, though, because I think especially when you're new in your career, you think, oh, well, I don't know anything, and they're the experts, they know better. I mean, I wouldn't even challenge editors before, right? So when you were saying earlier, you were talking about an editor makes a comment and you think, oh, I don't really agree with that. It took me a while to get to that point.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what else I realized was that sometimes I've worked with so many different editors at different publishing houses, and some of them are actually a little bit too prescriptive. And in the beginning of my career, I would think that meant I had to make that change. But then I later realized it's actually just their style. And what they're really doing is trying to help you solve a problem. But you don't have to do it their way. What you need to
Right.
do is kind of peel it back and ask yourself, what is the problem they're trying to solve? Like, why are they flagging this moment? And then you can solve it your way in a way that feels like authentic to
Oh, I
you
like that.
and the story. Yeah,
Hmm.
but it was
Yeah, I
the
like
same
that.
thing, like, it took me a long time to get to that point.
Yeah.
Not like a long, long time, but, like, a few books in to realize, "Oh, wait, I'm the author," right? And I think part of that comes from we spend so much time dreaming about being published authors. And so
Hmm.
I think there is a little bit of once you get quote unquote chosen, once you get an agent or an editor, a book deal, then you think, oh my gosh, thank you so much. And you just want to say yes to everything because at least for me, I was afraid that it would go away.
Right.
And you don't want to push back because, like, oh, what if they don't like me? What if I'm labeled as not easy to work with? But you're still the creator, right? You are the artist. This is
Hmm.
your story. These are your characters.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wanted to ask you about you talked about the audience, the age range being intuitive for you. But I do think it's a little bit of a confusing question for people because let's say you have like an 8-year-old character or like a 10-year-old character, let's say 10 for like a middle grade. But there are also adult books like literary fiction, where sometimes the character is 10 years old. So are there any guideposts that aren't necessarily just intuitive, but that you can kind of point to that help you figure out, like, oh, this is a teen voice that's speaking to me, or this is an authentic 10-year-old voice?
Yeah, so for I'll use an example. When I wrote Always, is it no, it wasn't. It was Flirting with Fate. When I wrote Flirting with Fate, the first scene came to me and I saw a woman dying. She was on her deathbed and these young women were around her. They were clearly teenaged, young women. And she was whispering in each of their ears. And so my thought process was, well, what is she whispering? I really want to know what she's whispering. And so that's how the beginning of the book started. And so, because in the scene I saw the young women, I knew that it had already been decided, right? That's how the scene came to me. And I'm not kidding, Evelyn. I don't think there has been one time, I think I'm 12 books in now. I can't remember that I've changed the opening scene, honestly.
Wow. Wow.
I really don't think, I mean, again, it goes back to trusting your gut and your intuition. That doesn't mean that the editor won't have questions or won't want you to expand on something, but I trust that opening scene. And so I think that it's, with the characters that I see, it's also, what is the treatment of this story? What are some of the issues that I'm going to delve into? Is this story about identity? Is this story about first love? What is it about? And I think once I start puzzling, I don't automatically know, right? But once I start kind of putting those pieces together, then I realize. So with Enchanted Hacienda, I knew that was an adult book from the very beginning because the very first scene I saw was were these rolling hills during the golden hour and all these beautiful flowers, and I knew they were enchanted, and I wanted to know more about the women who lived on this farm and who cultivated these flowers, and I knew that it was going to have a lot of adult content, and there was no way it's kind of like and I know you can appreciate this as an artist. There was no way for me to take that story and I just wanted to know more and then change it to a children's book, right? It's kind of the same thing when you're watching a movie and it starts in the beginning. There's a promise made, right, to us as viewers. We make promises to our readers, and we kind of get a sense, right? As soon as you see that opening scene, you kind of get a sense of, oh, this book is going to, or this movie is going to be a thriller, or it's going to have violence, or it's going to have, whatever content. And so again, it does go back to a lot of intuition. And I think it's also, what do you want to write? Like, don't try to write for the market. Write what you love. Like, write because you have to know the answer to the question.
Ah, I love that so much. And this really resonates with me. And it goes back to something you said just a little earlier, too, about when you have to go for a hike, when you feel like something's not connecting. And I feel it for me. That has happened when I'm trying to write a new book and I'm looking at it with too much of a business lens first. I'm thinking, okay, you know what is the next marketable idea that I can write with a big commercial hook? What's that 2-line pitch that's going to get like Reese Witherspoon's book club being like, oh yes, that's the book I want. When I lead with only business intent first, there's no real story for me there. And so I can have a great high concept. And then this just happened to me a couple weeks ago. I just was hitting my head against the wall trying to outline a new idea, which is an amazing hook. But there was nothing more than a hook. That's all it was. It was just a, hey, I think that if I actually managed to write this book, it would sell a lot of copies. But you know what? If you can't write something with soul, and like you said, something that really connects to the artist part of you, you're not going to sell a lot of copies because people, they'll feel it, I think.
Right. Do you think that some of that is really the culture of publishing? On one hand, I feel like we get mixed messages as writers, right? And I wonder if, and I don't know the answer. I'm genuinely asking, is there this culture that is being bred that does not necessarily leave space for just the art and the love and the soul? Does it always have to be this over here? And I wonder if there's like some tension between those two.
I think that there is, but I wouldn't blame publishing as an industry. I think it's just kind of the nature of the question. And I actually asked one of my very best friends this question as well. I said, what is more important to you at this stage in your career? And she's kind of in a similar place as you and I. She's published many books. And I said, would you rather be known for the art or would you rather sell a million copies of a book? Because the million copies, that's the commercial part, right? And she thought about it and she said, I mean, I'd like to be an artist that sells a lot of copies. I said, yeah, but you can't have that, right? Like, that's all what we all want. And like, it does
Right.
happen, sometimes, but like, really purely, if you have to choose which one it is. And she said she thinks that where she is in her personal life, she wants to be commercial for now because she needs to make money, but ultimately she wants to be able to write just for her art. And the artsy things she wants to write, they're kind of niche. And I think that that's a realistic point, a way to look at this career, because you can scream about how like the gatekeepers aren't letting you write this like beautiful niche thing, but realistically, let's say maybe there's only like 500 people in the country that would want to read that, right? So like,
Right.
from that point of view, you're not going to sell a million copies, right?
Right.
But then you get to
Right.
write this really pure thing. On the other hand, you could write something that's super super commercial, and it's going to hit it big, and that's great, and I think some actors have this philosophy as well. They'll make one
Mhm.
commercial movie, and then they'll make an indie one, like write one for them, one for me,
Yes.
that kind of philosophy. So yeah, I wouldn't blame the publishing industry. I think it's just the nature of being an artist and trying to
Mhm.
balance that pureness that you have with also being able to make a living, right? And or you could just do it purely what you want, but then have a totally separate job that pays you a salary, right? I mean, that's
Yeah.
a different kind of way to approach it.
Yeah.
So, okay, your middle grade series, so the Stormrunner series and Shadow Bruja, are with Rick Riordan's imprint. I would love to hear about your experience working with him. And for anyone who is listening who maybe is not familiar with Rick Riordan, the name, he's the author of the Percy Jackson series. So, really an icon in middle grade. And then he got to have his own imprint at Disney. So, he was
Mhm.
basically a publisher. And you got to work with him. What was that like?
It was really incredible. I mean, it was such a wonderful, special time, I think, in publishing. And it was just a snapshot, right? It was here, it was gone, it was fleeting. And it felt really miraculous. And I know that that sounds a little bit hyperbolic, but I had gone through about 7 years of rejection. So my first book got published, and then it was nothing. It was just rejection after rejection after rejection after rejection. And that's why I always tell writers, if you can stick it out, depending on your mental health and where your heart is and where you are emotionally, because I know sometimes we just don't have the bandwidth and the resilience to keep going. But if you can stick it out, you know, the cream always does rise to the top. I mean, it really does. And you just need that one yes. And that's what Rick was for me. And we had actually submitted, I think they'd done a call. And so you had to turn in 3 chapters and a synopsis. And I remember my mom asking, "Oh, when do you think you'll hear back from Disney?" I said, "8 months," because publishers take forever. And my agent got a call the next day from Steph Laurie, who is now retired, but just an icon and just an amazing editor, that her and Rick had already read it and loved it. And
Oh,
that
wow.
they,
Wait, so
yeah.
this was when you said there was a call initially, it was like a call for auditions, basically,
Hmm.
like submit
Yes.
ideas and sample
Yes.
writing.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So, and then of course it went through the editorial process and all of that, but it was really wonderful. And he is such a generous writer to really elevate other writers and to share that stage with them. And he does it in such a generous way. He really does. So it was amazing.
I've heard he's a great mentor.
Yeah.
And I mean, it sounds like you had a great experience. And you said it was fleeting. So like the Rick Riordan imprint has now it's closed, right?
I think so. I don't know if it's official or I know that they're not publishing at the rate that they were. But like all imprints, they kind of, come and go and change and shift. And I was really, really fortunate to be the second one out of the gate. So it was kind of
That's
fun being the new kid on the block.
Yeah, that's amazing. Did you do any events with Rick? Because I know sometimes he'll invite his other authors to like come and do an event with him if he has a book, or like he'll show up to your event.
Yeah, we did several events together and it was a lot of fun. We actually did this really fun Broadway event together and some of the other Rick Riordan Presents authors. There were a couple more of us. He invited on tour when I think it was a book last year, one of his middle grade novels, or maybe the year before. And he invited the RRP authors on tour with him. And so it was kind of fun to like be on stage and then I got to grill him and ask him all the questions and talk about his book, which was fun.
Oh, that's amazing. What's the hardest question that you asked him?
Mm, oh gosh, I'd have to think about that. I don't put him on the spot a whole lot in public, although I will tell you something really funny. We were backstage in an event in New York, and I don't know if you know Rosh Chokshi, but we're good friends. And so Rosh and I are talking about this very racy book, and I'm not going to mention it. And Rick, his little ears perk up, and he says, "What are you guys talking about?" We're like, "Nothing, nothing." And so we end up telling him about the book. And he read it and then tweeted about it and we were just like dying and then he tagged us in the tweet. We were mortified. And so we'll definitely razz him behind the scenes. I don't do a lot of it in public.
I love that. I love that so much. And I do know Roshni. She and I co-authored a book together with Sandhya Menon. So she's one of my very best
Oh,
friends.
yeah, she's so
Yeah.
lovely, so lovely.
Yeah, and I think she was number one, right, in the Rick Riordan imprint
Yes.
with Aru
Yep.
Shah. Yeah, so that's
Hmm.
amazing. Amazing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so Creative Inspired Happy is not just a podcast, it's also a community online. And so I like to ask our community members if they have questions for our podcast guests. And we do have a question for you today from Chastity A. And Chastity wants to know, do you do school events? And if you do, what sorts of things do you do with the schools and with the students?
I love doing school events. I really do. And I love engaging with the students. And so it just depends on the book that I'm talking about. But I have a presentation, and the presentation might, so for example, Daggers of Ire, we might talk about what kind of witch are you, these elements of magic. But I always start talking about where I find inspiration, where I get ideas. And then I play a game with the students. And so they can be engaged and they can be a part of the process. And they realize once they play this what if game that they can come up with their own ideas like this. I mean, it's just instant, right? And I think so often young people, many of them will be afraid of judgment or they're afraid somebody's not going to like it. And so then they let those fears kind of, immobilize them. And so we do that. And I have some other really fun little party tricks that I like to do with the students that are very natural to me and my personality. And I just have fun with them. I just have a lot of fun because they always have the best questions.
And are you doing these mostly for your middle grade books, or have you done it for the YA books as well?
Mostly middle grade. I mean, I've mostly done middle grade. The only things I've done are just like more bookstore events for young adult and adult. Yeah.
Okay, cool. How do you get school events? Like, do you have a speaking agent, or are you just once you do one, your name kind of just like starts filtering through like the different teachers?
Yeah, I do have a speaking agent, Unbound Authors. I think their link is on my website. And so many of them get filtered through them. And then other people are working directly with the publicists at the whatever publisher it is. And so sometimes things get filtered through my publisher. They never come directly to me.
Okay, got it. That's super helpful. Okay,
Yeah.
this is a totally different question, and this is from Julia R. And she is finishing up this month writing a novel, so novel writing challenge. And so what she wants to
Congratulations.
know is, yeah, what is some of your best advice for revision?
Well, so I will say this, and I don't know if this answers the question very well. And sometimes I wish I had a more formulaic response for people. I really do, because I know what that felt like. I wanted to sink my teeth into answers I could actually utilize. But writing is such an alchemical process. It truly, truly is. And for me, I cannot even begin the revision process until I'm centered and I'm at that place where I can really listen. But in terms of something that's more concrete than that, I think that I like to take really small chunks. I don't think about the entire story all at once. And, I mean, books are written one word at a time, one sentence, one paragraph, one page, and that's it, right? I never sit down to write a book and think, oh, I have to write this whole book today. It takes the time that it takes. And so for revisions, I think just taking pieces of the revision and working on them at a slower pace, I think is always, always helpful.
I think it can be very daunting to try to think about the entire book at
Can't.
once, and so I really
Yeah.
like this advice about just doing it like little piece by little piece.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so just to wrap up, I would love to hear what do you have next? You have another book coming out at the very beginning of the year, March, I believe.
Yes, I have the companion novel to Enchanted Hacienda. It's called Anatomy of Magic, and we're going to be following a different sister, and it is the reclamation of love and heartache. And it is Liliana who has the magic of memory. So there's a lot of influence in terms of what do our memories say about us? Do we carry our memories in our mind? Do we carry them in our heart? How do they shape who we are? How do they shape our identity? How do they shape the way we move through the world? So I really played a lot with memory. And then I have The Fault to Daggers of Ire coming out, and I have a really big secret project that I'm hoping is going to be announced soon, that I cannot wait to talk about. But let's just say it's very fairy tale esque.
Ooh, okay. So if people want to follow you online to make sure they don't miss that news, where are the best places to find you?
Definitely Instagram. I on Threads. I mostly talk about my dogs. So probably Instagram would be the best place.
Okay, awesome. I will drop that link in the episode notes for anyone who's looking for you after the show. And thank you so much for spending time with us. This was so wonderful and warm and informative.
No, thank you, Evelyn. I really appreciate you having me on.
Want more writing advice and career insight? Join thousands for free at creativeinspiredhappy.com to go behind the scenes with best-selling authors and get access to our book club for writers, creativity challenges, and more. I can't wait to see you there.